Well, MOvember 2020, day 16, and I'm going to continue. There was a 4-part sort of series I wanted to do out of the Tale of Fully Feeling around dissociation, and the other night I'd done on the general theme dissociation. Now I'm going to look at hypervigilance. So this is from Pete Walker's Tale of Fully Feeling. Sometimes called hypervigilant, adult children automatically scan their environment for cues, wanting to know what is in front, behind, and left and to the right of them at all times. That's Gravitz and Bowden. Hypervigilance is the defensive strategy of becoming intensely watchful. Hypervigilance is a frozen, contracted, adrenalized state of anxiously anticipating hostility. In nature, it corresponds with the freeze response, the posture that animals instinctively assume when they cannot utilize their fight or flight response to combat or escape attack. Animals and humans reflexively adopt the freeze response when their attackers or predators are too powerful to fight off or too swift to outrun. Many survivors were attacked so frequently in childhood that they had habitually hypervigilant, perpetually on guard, and painfully stuck in the freeze response. Children who are subject to ongoing abuse instinctively become hypervigilant, assuming rigid postures of intense observation and anticipation. They are like cornered animals, anxiously trying to blend in and not be noticed. They shrink, contract, and become as quiet and motionless as possible to avoid detection. Consequently, hypervigilance is sometimes also called the camouflage response. When we habitually shrink and freeze in hypervigilance, we damage our health through the chronic contraction of our body's musculature. Hypervigilant tightening impedes the function of circulation and respiration and blocks the flow of qi. Qi is the term acupuncturists use to describe the body's circulating supply of vital energy. The shallow breathing and the constant tension of hypervigilance depletes us and leaves us susceptible to injury and disease. Most of us experience varying degrees of hypervigilance. Only in times of the greatest threat does hypervigilance manifest as a paralytic kind of frozenness. When we are less hypervigilant, we resemble the night watchman in a store with a history of break-ins. We spend long periods of time with our attention locked behind our eyes, anxiously anticipating danger. Hypervigilance tends to increase in unfamiliar situations. Many survivors are reflexively wary of all unknown people, particularly those who resemble their original abusers. Hypervigilance is a child's only means of protection in an abusive family. By remaining perpetually on guard, they can sometimes recognize subtle indications that their parents are entering the attack mode. This gives them time to hide, create a distraction, or shrink and make themselves a smaller target. Sometimes it only provides them with enough time to get their hands up to cushion a sudden blow. I worked with several clients who were not even allowed this defense. They were forced to hold their hands by their sides while being slapped in the face. For those clients, dissociation was a more effective defense than hypervigilance. When I contemplate my own history of hypervigilance, it seems that my parents' hair-trigger tempers banished me from my heart and forced me to take up permanent residence in my head. There, I intently watched my parents for signs of impending abuse, rigorously censored my speech and movements, and desperately tried to figure out what kind of false self they wanted me to be. One of my clients recently discovered vivid evidence of her childhood training in hypervigilance and self-censorship. While watching a family film, she was appalled to see herself, a mere toddler, walking around the house, repeatedly smacking her own hand and decrying, "Bad girl, don't touch, bad girl, don't touch." When the camera panned on her parents, they laughed in delight and eagerly encouraged her to many encores. In a similar vein, I remember to my surprise years ago when I noticed myself alone in my apartment saying "I'm sorry" every time I dropped or bumped into something. I was outraged by this mindless habit when I finally became aware of it. My parents had made me so shamefully apologetic that I was apologizing to the walls and the floor. This realization eventually helped me to see how incessantly and unnecessarily hypervigilant I was about almost everything I said and did. Looking out to avoid looking in. The defensive posture of hypervigilance also serves as a distraction from emotional pain. Children numb their chronic fear, shame, and loneliness by keeping their attention constantly focused outwards. Many adult children are habituated to hypervigilance because their unresolved grief threatens to emerge whenever they are not on guard. Grieving releases the emotional tension that keeps us suspended in hypervigilance, allowing us to relax and become more agile in our bodies. 20 years of grief work has improved both my physical health and my athletic performance. Although I am nearly 50 years old and should be declining in my basketball skills, I continue to improve beyond any level I previously reached. I hold my own and run the court for hours with men who are in their 20s. I believe grieving created this benefit by diminishing my performance anxiety. Performance anxiety is the insidious hybrid of hypervigilance, perfectionism, and emotional flashbacks that throttles and inhibits our ability to respond gracefully and spontaneously. Performance anxiety is stimulated by the unconscious fear that we will be treated as harshly as we were in our families if we miscue or falter in any way. One of the most tragic losses of childhood is that many of us don't participate in games, sports, dancing, and other forms of play because of unresolved performance anxiety. Before I grieved substantially, performance anxiety severely impeded my natural athleticism. I was so terrified of making mistakes that I often froze whenever I needed to act. When I was at bat or trying to catch the ball often went by me before I could respond. And when I did catch the ball, I'd often try so hard to make a perfect throw that I'd throw wild or wait too long to make the play. Fortunately, my performance anxiety occasionally abated when I played with friends, and so I continued to play. Whenever my hypervigilance was restimulated. Sorry guys, Pete has an amazing vocabulary and language that I don't possess, but I learn a lot. So you'll have to just allow me to stumble over some of the words. So whenever my hypervigilance was re-stimulated, however, I made an inordinate number of miscues. Each error then drove my hypervigilance up another notch, and I contracted more and more, desperately trying not to screw up. If the play then came in my direction, my mind vacillated painfully and inefficiently between such choices as jump or dodge, pass or shoot, swing or take, run or hold. I was so locked up in my head that my body's instinctive talents were rendered inoperable. My worst performance anxiety occurred when there were observers or participants who reminded me of my parents. At such times, my hypervigilance escalated into fright, and my performance sometimes spiraled downward into a humiliating series of errors. In my worst disasters on the playing field, I became so completely hamstrung by fear that I sometimes disassociated and didn't even register that the ball was coming in my direction. Once a basketball pass bounced off my head and went ingloriously into the basket. On other occasions, my performance deteriorated because I was lost in prayer, obsessively begging for divine intervention. Please, God, don't let him hit the ball to me. I promise I'll go to Mass and communion every day for a week if I just don't have to make one more error. My sports hypervigilance hampered me for decades with an exaggerated fear of dropping the ball. Because of this, I developed little in my full potential in sports. I never risked new moves, for I couldn't bear to make the initial errors that are a requisite to acquiring new skills and perfecting old ones. My performance anxiety remained intact until I began using my anger to resolve it. I did this by quietly getting angry inside every time I felt afraid on the court. I barked back at the voices of doom that accompanied my hypervigilance. I blasted my parents for inculcating me with fear. I told my inner child that I wouldn't let them or anyone else abuse us for making a mistake. I used this technique hundreds of times before it allowed me to feel safe enough to begin relaxing in sports. Many years of practice have rewarded me now with the ability to treat mistakes as learning opportunities rather than catastrophes that deserve humiliation. My hypervigilance continuously atrophies as I grow old, atrophies as I grow older, and I increasingly connect with my relaxed, instinctive know-how of my body. Almost every time I play basketball now, I marvel at how much my reflexes take over and guide my performance. I can hardly believe how many missed shots I willingly weathered to become relatively proficient at shooting ambidextrously within 5 feet of the basket. Healthy hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is self-destructive to the degree that it is chronic. There are many situations in life, especially in modern industrial societies, in which hypervigilance is necessary and helpful. Safe driving, for example, requires considerable hypervigilance. Those who are not hypervigilant in traffic have many more accidents than those who drive defensively. They are more susceptible to being hit by disassociated drivers. Mild hypervigilance is also useful in our social lives. Many of us are prone to attract people as abusive as our parents via the phenomenon known as repetition compulsion. See Chapter 7 in this book. Because of this, we need to be more discriminating in choosing friends. Cautiousness with new acquaintances gives us the necessary time to assess whether they are consistently fair and respectful. Some survivors shame themselves because they always feel hypervigilant around new people. Those of us who suffered long-term abuse need to accept that we may never feel relaxed around others until we get to know them well. And the hypervigilance dissociation two-step. An adult child can be habituated to both hypervigilance and dissociation. These defenses coexist in the survivor whose body is hypervigilantly tense and contracted, but whose awareness is disassociated and not preoccupied with careful watching. More common is the survivor who switches rapidly from the one defense to the other in an all or none manner. Hypervigilant to the point of exhaustion, he suddenly and silently drifts off far away into his own disassociative world. There, he remains foggily lost and out of contact until a new threatening stimulus catapults him back into hypervigilance. Many survivors are strangers to the less extreme zones of alertness and relaxation that lie between the poles of hypervigilance and dissociation. Effective grieving opens up the vast territory of consciousness that exists between these two extremes. So next, out of this book, I'll talk about obsessiveness, but that is a little on hypervigilance. I certainly grew up in a home like that. I absolutely relate to that musculature tension. And I was only thinking when I was skateboarding with my boys the other day, I learned to ride in one fashion and I never got out of it. I was just too scared. I could watch other people be much more in their bodies and I just never felt it. And it's been interesting watching my boys without that level of fear and lots of support just hit milestone after milestone, and to see their healthy fear. And I remember hugging Maverick through it the other day when he was just couldn't get this new move and wanted to give up and wanted to go home, and I knew he wasn't ready to go home, so we sat with it and then we went together and we did it, and I just felt a lot of joy in my heart because he's such a courageous boy. I hope this has been useful. I love Pete Walker's work. Guys, tune in tomorrow. Be gentle with your heart. And I thought I'd wear my MOvember hat this time round for this one. And yeah, if you know someone that's growing a mustache, I know MOvember, there's lots of, with COVID-19 and so many competing good and worthy causes. But if you've got someone that you know at work or a friend or family growing a mo, please donate to their page. It does. I've had a few donations. Thank you, Fiona. And there's another one I've got to work out. Fiona McKinnon donated, which is my mum-in-law. So thank you, Fiona. And I know that the money goes to a good cause just to deal and help with men's health. And I look forward to making a video tomorrow. With that, I'll say good night.